Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Peter Gower, as you probably know by now, president of this august group. We start tonight with a memory. The unfortunate death of Brian Osborne, who was president of this society for 3 years and then went on to be president of the Ontario Historical Society. Author of many articles, but most especially with Donald Sweenson, of a wonderful book, if you haven't looked at it, on Kingston, called Kingston, Building on the Past. And then 20 years later, after Donald's death, he revised it and wrote Kingston, Building on the Past for the Future. And it's a very readable book, and it mixes history and geography, which was both of his subjects. So Kingston has lost a major resource in Kingston's history and geography, and somebody who was always willing to share his expertise. And we will miss him very much. 2 notices of meetings, one of which you will know about, I hope, one of which you may not know about. The City of Kingston runs a series of lunchtime 1-hour meetings in Memorial Hall, and one of them is next Thursday, April the 23rd, when Jennifer McKendry will talk about, and it's a long title, but it's a fascinating one, the pros and cons of the 20th century mail order catalogues used to promote bungalows and home designs and building plans. Because as you may know, when your Sears or Eaton's catalogue arrived, somewhere in the middle of that, you could buy all that you needed to build your house. And it would be shipped out. And if you were good, you could do it yourself. And if you needed to get help, then you could get help. But everything was included. And that is why, as you look around, you will see very similar types of buildings. So that is next Thursday, 12 o'clock. It'll last less than an hour because it's meant for people at their lunchtime in Memorial Hall, free. You're more than welcome to go. And I just remind you that in June, when we do not have a Wednesday evening meeting, we will have a Saturday afternoon, June the 6th, in Cataraqui Cemetery, when we remember on the day of his death, Sir John A. Macdonald. It's about a 1-hour meeting with a speaker, and it's always in just gorgeous sunshine, and you can thoroughly enjoy it. I guarantee it. Before Paul lost his voice, he assured me it was going to be sunshine that day. And from Paul, he's not antisocial tonight. He just doesn't have a voice because of laryngitis. I have. So, Duncan?
Good evening and welcome to our April lecture. I'm Duncan McDowell and welcome you to our meeting this evening. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Thomas Harrison, our speaker this evening, who will talk about a little known 1950s visit to Canada by a prominent American politician, Vice President Richard Nixon. U.S. vice presidents usually reside in the political shadows. John Nance Gardner, Roosevelt's vice president through the 1930s, once said that, quote, "The vice presidency in itself is nothing more than a warm place to sit with a good view of the parade." Of late, that has been less so, as vice presidents have taken on a more activist role in projecting American power. Whether we approve of him or not, Vice President J.D. Vance is currently projecting just such an American influence in the world, perhaps giving him a better view of Trump's parade. Thomas Harrison brings considerable talent to his investigation of Vice President Dick Nixon. A lawyer by training and now a professor of animal law and ethics at Durham College, his interests range from horse farming to playwriting. This July, he will produce In the Key of Blue, an original musical celebrating the life and music of Blue Rodeo at Kingston's Isabel Bader Center. His pen has also carried him in other directions, as a contributor to newspapers such as the Globe and Mail and the Hill Times. His talk this evening will come from his first work of nonfiction, Searching for Richard Nixon, copies of which he has on hand for sale this evening. So without further ado, I welcome Dr. Harrison.
Say thank you very much for that warm welcome, Duncan. I had a couple flashbacks when you were doing the introductory remarks because back in the 1980s, one of my mentors and longtime history professor was Donald Swainson. And I was familiar with the book that you mentioned that the individual that you were talking about had helped him write. So it's kind of fun to come back to Kingston, and I do get here whenever I can. It is my second home. I was teacher at the law faculty for a few years as well. So it's always nice to be here. Of course, my purpose for being here today is to talk to you about my book, which is Searching for Richard Nixon. And we do have a few copies available to you. I subtitled it Finding Refuge and Making a Home in Prince Edward County. And it really is about the Nixon visit in 1957 and also in 1972, because he comes later on a state visit as president. But you can see there's a picture of me reading the picture at my home, at my farm down in Prince Edward County. It really is the story of my investigation into the Nixon visit, which, took a turn that included not only historical nonfiction, but also memoir and, a few other little turns here and there too, some creative nonfiction as well, about dramatizing the events that occurred in 1957 as well. Hi, Arthur. There's Arthur Mills, Kingston's own, who is also in the show. So, and who is probably the originator and source of the reason why I wrote the book in the first place. So I really appreciate you coming. Appreciate you all being here, actually. I could talk, I'm scheduled to talk for an hour or so, and I'm sure at least some of you will have some questions, but I could talk for hours about this because there's so many little sub-stories, and I'm not going to tell you them all because I want you to hopefully buy the book. So I'm not going to share all my secrets with you tonight. But as I say, it is the story of Nixon's 57 visit and his 72 visit. It relates to the present day as well. I saw a lot of historical parallels and his synchronicities in the visit. But I did it mostly from my home in Prince Edward County. And at the moment, at least, I'm a lawyer and a teacher, but I'm also a farmer, and we rescue horses. So there I am on the cover of a horse magazine. Andrea, who's my assistant today in selling books, writes a column for them regularly. Oh, perfect. Thank you. And there I am cutting hay a couple summers ago in one of our back fields. So I come by, my respect for the country and the countryside in Eastern Ontario quite honestly. And there's a picture of Arthur there. There we are doing your book art, where he dedicated to Jimmy Carter before he passed away. And then that's in 2016 in the upper left-hand side with Jimmy and Rosalind at the Maranatha Baptist Church in Plains, Georgia, which Arthur has been kind enough to invite me to go with him down and have a few meals with Jimmy Carter. There we are in the Plains Hotel in 2010, and there I am with Rosalind Carter in one of those visits, 2011, I think that one was. So, that is really at the genesis of the trip, which I'll get to in just a sec. But while we were there, one time coming back in the car, we were talking about Eastern Ontario, and we were talking about, all the people in Eastern Ontario that have had sort of an outsized impact on history. And at one point, we started talking about John Foster Dulles, who, as Duncan mentioned to me earlier, and I cover in the book, had a cottage on Main Duck Island out in Eastern Ontario. And he would fly on a float plane from Henderson Harbor and come up and spend weekends and sometimes longer periods of time at the island where there was no power. He and his wife would go there and he'd chop wood. And of course, at this point in time, he's the Secretary of State of the United States. His brother is the head of the CIA. So, this is a fairly important person who's making regular visits to Canada. I said to Art, well, we talked a little bit about those details. And he said to me, Nixon was there too, right? And I said, what do you mean? He says, oh yeah, there's some story. I forget all the details, but he was here in Picton, I think, and he went drinking in a bar. And I looked at my friend Arthur. I said, no, you can't be serious. I've never heard of that. And by this point, I'd lived for 15 or 20 years in Prince Edward County. So, it's a pretty insular place, but people have been living there since the like people live there and they don't go away. Like it's a very close-knit town, and you hear all the stories. I had never heard this story before. So I went and looked, and sure enough, in Nixon's memoirs, I found a transcript of his speech that he gives in 1972 when he's president. And he stands up at Rideau Hall. Yes, Arthur. Oh, is it? It is. Oh, perfect. Well, there you go. Synchronicity, right? He stands up, and he'd been put on the spot, so he spoke extemporaneously without notes, but of course, all the aides to the presidents are writing down everything he said, and he includes it in his memoir. And he gets up and he tells a big, long story about the best time he ever spent in Canada was the time he came in 1957, and nobody in the room would really know this, but he knows Picton better than just about anybody. And he went drinking in a bar, and he had all this great time, and he golfed and he sailed, and everybody clapped, and they went off and did their own thing. And I read these details and I thought, wow, I mean, can this be true, or is this just a story from a politician? So my first question was, did he actually go drinking in a bar in Kingston, and if so, where? I needed to try to nail down details of when it happened and what were the circumstances. I was interested with who else might have been on the trip with Nixon. What did they do when they were here? Did anyone in Prince Edward County or elsewhere remember meeting Nixon? Because, it's a long time ago, but not that long ago. And I thought, well, maybe there's somebody around who remembers it. What other details could I find? The thing that really amazed me about what Arthur told me, and the thing that still quite stuns me, is if you know anything about presidential history and presidential historians in the United States, is they do not go to the washroom without it having been documented. You can literally go back and read the daily diaries of every president, and they have every single minute documented. So to find an undocumented episode of presidential history, in this case, vice presidential history, that has never been really documented or recorded was really quite remarkable to me. I thought when I started it, well, it'll just be, a short article. It ended up taking me 7 years of research. And it ended up spinning off a whole bunch of other stories, part of which I'm going to tell you here today. Okay, so as I say, it took a little time, and I'm involved in Picton. I do a number of different things here. I interviewed David Frum, who's come to visit, help us fundraise for the library in Picton a few times. He's very interested in the Nixon book. He was very supportive as well. Former Premier of the province of Ontario, Kathleen Wynne, was there. She came to one of our talks one time and was also very supportive. So, there were a lot of things going. So I'm going to read you an excerpt from the book, and this will give you an idea of kind of where it all goes and how it started. Okay, so I was trying to figure out, and I did find details of this, so I tried to imagine the scene in my head, and this is what I came up with. I imagined the moment Richard Nixon stepped onto the dock in Rochester, New York. A few pictures captured events from that weekend. As I view them now, it looks like the vice president put a real effort into appearing casual as he escaped his responsibilities on a secret getaway across the northern border to Canada in 1957. Even for that era, he's dressed oddly. Khaki pants with a striped belt and a plaid shirt buttoned up to his collar. The day following the American independence celebration, summer had arrived, but Nixon's stiff appearance betrayed the challenges of some public figure who, though on holiday, had trouble relaxing. Of course, no one in such a high office is ever really alone. As much as he valued privacy, virtually every little thing in the life of the future president of the United States became part of the narrative he spun about himself. Nixon's low-key 1950s getaway to Prince Edward County is a small part of that story, which he told to a receptive crowd on his Ottawa state visit in 1972. It was hard at first to appreciate that a notorious world leader, an American president no less, had this obscure connection to my quiet rural home. Accounts of his Canadian visit are fragmented, and the gaps in the record of his trip intrigued and puzzled the historian in me. As with so many things about Richard Nixon, the details he later gave about his visit to the Bay of Quinte region were also confused or false. Facing impeachment in 1974 for covering up criminal acts, he's the only president in U.S. history who resigned. it will come as no surprise to anyone familiar with Nixon's rise and fall and his capacity for deception that he didn't always let the facts get in the way of a good story. Okay, so he starts out at the Rochester Yacht Club on July 5th, 1957. And he sails across the lake. And the first question I had is, why did he do this? I thought, well, maybe he was visiting his friend John Foster Dulles, who was in some ways his mentor. Nixon had a very tempestuous relationship with Eisenhower, Ike, who was the president of the United States, and Dulles sort of intervened and handled Nixon and kind of gave him pointers about how to handle the elder former general. Nixon was at that point a young former senator and congressperson, and so was really kind of out of his depth. And John Foster Dulles was, well educated and experienced in Washington along with his brother. And so I thought, well, maybe the two of them are going to Main Duck Island out in the middle of Lake Ontario to visit. At this time in 1957, we're having some pretty big international events, and John Foster Dulles and his brother Alan Dulles are playing a dangerous game of international brinksmanship. No echoes with today at all. They have been, planning to invade Cuba, to overthrow the Cuban government. They've been have succeeded in overthrowing the Iranian government, the Persian government at the time. They've been involved in coups in Indonesia, and of course they had Vietnam, which was already starting to boil up. So there was a lot of involvement around the world, and so Nixon and John Foster Dulles would have had a lot to talk about. That's John Foster Dulles there. That's Nixon and JFD, I call him, John Foster Dulles, and Suharto from Indonesia, which was another one of the dictators that the CIA supported in the 1950s. By 1957 on Main Duck Island, the only other resident of the island was the lighthouse keeper, who was a man named Howard Dunn. John Foster Dulles regularly took his float plane, according to Jack Johnson from the Watertown Daily, who was kind enough to give me access to his newspaper archives. And they left from Henderson Harbor. He would take the float plane out to the island. He had a little boat on the island. He used to like to sail around. So he would show up in Kingston. He would show up in Premier's Cove in Prince Edward County and sometimes in Picton Bay by himself. There was no security. This was not an unusual sight at the time. John Foster Dulles loved the privacy of Main Ducks. He could swim in the nude, he'd chop wood, and he'd go for walks. In fact, the last time before the 1957 visit of Nixon, I was trying to connect them up, you see. But I wasn't able to do that. I did find out, though, that John Foster Dulles actually goes to the island in the fall of 1956 with the explicit intention of trying to solve the Suez crisis. And this is the crisis where American forces had been watching as French and British invaded the Suez Canal zone and occupied it, and it looked like the potential for a world war was about to break out. So it's kind of ironic in my mind, too, that here is John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State, trying to solve an international crisis, comes to Canada to do it. The crisis was later solved by none other than Lester Pearson, right? So he comes to the country of the man who actually ends up solving the crisis in the end. Just as a footnote, John Foster Dulles is one of two Secretaries of State in the story. William Rogers is the other. He's from Rochester, so he also was purportedly on the trip, but there's some question about that. So I decided it was important that we follow in Nixon's footsteps. So I had a friend of mine who owns a commercial fisher in Prince Edward County, and Andrea and I went out on his boat, and we visited Main Duck Island. You can see the famous lighthouse there. And what I was told was the remains of John Foster Dulles' cabin that had burned to the ground. Now, as it turns out, that's not true. But at the time, I didn't know that. In fact, what happened, as I understand it, is someone actually bought the cabin and had it disassembled brick by brick and then reassembled, and it's now residing in a private compound in Upper New York State. So it actually still exists. The things you discover when you're doing this kind of research. Anyways, I also took a painting during this. So I painted a picture. There's a picture of me coming back into Picton Harbor, and there's a large picture of the Main Duck Lighthouse as well. The other possibility I thought, if he's not visiting John Foster Dulles, is maybe he's seeking some back channel information about the state of political affairs in Canada in 1957. And so that sounds unlikely, but then when you start reading about Nixon's history, you realize how often he would do this. He loved clandestine visits to other countries. And in fact, when he opens up China, right, this is how he does it. He sends Henry Kissinger and Sinkrit to China to engage in negotiations. When he was trying to force Vietnam to sign a peace treaty, he secretly bombed, Cambodia and Vietnam. And so he was not above doing this at all. And so I thought, well, maybe given what was happening in Canada at the time, this was something he was interested in doing. I say here, this is the other thing too. 1968, he's facing an election and he opens up negotiations with the government of Vietnam. He's a presidential candidate who has no status, and he gets a woman who has connections to the South Vietnamese government to tell the government not to negotiate a deal with the president, because if Nixon won, he would get a better deal for them. And so this has only just come out in the last decade or so, the proof of this, which would be a breach of the Logan Act and would be treason. So Nixon had a lot of secrets, and it wasn't just Watergate. He was looking to hide a bunch of different things. In Canada in 1957, surprise, surprise, we had a new prime minister. John Diefenbaker had just recently, by surprise, beat the Liberals. And this was really quite shocking to Diefenbaker, as much as to anybody else, I think. The Liberals had been so confident that they would win this election, as they had since, what was it, 1935 was the last time the Liberals weren't in power. They had left off signing the North American Air Defense Treaty till after the election, because they thought, well, we don't have time to do that before the election. We'll just wait till later. Well, Diefenbaker comes in, and at first, at least, he indicates that he's not supportive of the North American Air Defense Treaty. So this gets some concern going in Ottawa, and I've got records of the communications back and forth about whether or not Diefenbaker would support it and what were they going to do. And this was really important for North American air defense for a couple of reasons I'll get into. But for a little while there in June and July of 1957, it looked like Canada wasn't going to be part of NORAD. I also thought, was there any possibility that Nixon might be interested in secret technologies that might have existed and might have been present in Prince Edward County in particular, right? So I have the UFO there. I talk a little bit in the book about the Marysburg Vortex, which, if you know anything about Lake Ontario, some of you are probably sailors, there's a shoal, a circular shoal out there. You can see it on Google Maps if you go online. And it is a known shipping hazard that when the lake water goes down, it is either at or just below the surface, has sunk several ships. It is the remains of a comet or a meteorite that hit that area 450 million years ago. And so it's famously a bad place to have a compass, because the compasses don't work properly. And there's stories of ghost stories and stories of aliens and this sort of thing. So, it's kind of like our Area 51, but out in the middle of Lake Ontario, just off the shore here, Kingston. Which I'd all dismiss as just nonsense, except I've seen the UFOs. I was sitting on my deck. I overlooked Point Peter, which is at the south end of the county, one night. And I was sitting out there. I used to smoke. Back then I was having a smoke. And I saw these glowing balls of light out over the water. And I was like, long enough that I could go get my camera, and I took a video. And so I looked out afterwards to see, maybe it was phosphorus flares, the air defense, air rescue was firing. No, they had no operations on that night, they're saying. Anyways, I thought this was really interesting. So, there's always the possibility that there's secret technology that's remained secret. But we do know that there was actually secret technology present in Prince Edward County in 1957 that hasn't remained secret, and that was they were testing the Avro Arrow. They were doing flight simulations. They were pitching models of the Avro Arrow off the point at Point Peter, and they were landing in the water. They were also, at least by some accounts, engaging in engine tests with what they called an Orenda ring. So they'd hook the engine onto a circular platform, and they'd run. And if you look on Google Earth, you can see there's still remains of an Orenda ring at the south end of the county. So this was Canada's new advanced fighter. And so maybe the president or vice president was interested in finding out about whether or not this was going to be a viable purchase option for the Americans, or something that they would want to be interested in. Interesting. And then, of course, it was also a turning point in the Cold War, which Nixon would have known about, but was not more publicly known when he came, which is that the Russians were about to make a massive advance in space technology, right? And most people, even by 1957, did not really appreciate the extra lethality of hydrogen bombs, which are exponentially more devastating than atomic bombs. One bomb would wipe out Toronto from downtown Toronto right out to Pickering in a circle all around. One bomb, not, two or three or five. And so the idea that bombers would come over the North Pole and drop atomic bombs on things, which was what NORAD was designed to defend against, was probably already starting to be a bit archaic, because later that year they launched Sputnik, which meant that the Russians could now launch interballistic and intercontinental missiles with nuclear warheads attached. So Nixon, there was secret intelligence that this was going to happen, and Nixon would have been aware of that, even if nobody else was. So, this might have been something that was on his mind. Get that NORAD treaty signed, find out about the secret jets, what's going on here. There's no real evidence that he was on an official visit, though. I looked really hard. I asked around. I tried to find it. He does end up flying out of the Trenton Royal Air Station. So at some level of officialdom, somebody would have had to give him permission to do that. It's interesting because a couple of things here in terms of coincidences. The NORAD agreement does get approved later that fall. So shortly after his visit to Canada, suddenly, coincidentally, the Americans do approve NORAD. And the Avro Arrow does go ahead. Coincidentally, goes ahead on the exact same day that the Sputnik satellite is launched. They announced the production of the Avro Arrow. And I say in the book, this might have been actually the nail in the coffin of the Avro Arrow, because the launch of Sputnik meant that fighter defense of bombers was probably only going to be good for a few more years. The other thing is, of course, Eastern Ontario, Trenton, but also Kingston were famously film production centers in the 1940s, right? And so Nixon would have known about the area because he was a film aficionado. He loved movies. He watched 400 movies the time he was in office as president. I have a list of all the movies he watched. Really interesting to go along and see what movie he watched and then, see what he did the next day, because sometimes the movies seem to have affected what he did. One of the movies he liked, he loved James Cagney. Yankee Doodle Dandy was one of his favorite movies, but he also liked Captains of the Clouds, which was the story about a Canadian bush pilot that gets military training in Trenton at one of the British Commonwealth training bases, which we still have one of in Picton, right? The base 31 that's there. So that's kind of an interesting coincidence. So while I'm writing about this book, NORAD is in the news all of a sudden. Who, except at Christmas when Santa's, gets reports of NORAD from the Dew line, who knew? All of a sudden, NORAD shooting down UFOs over Lake Huron and and the Yukon in 2023. They're scrambling jets. Now it turns out they were Chinese weather balloons or something, right? But at the time, nobody knew what was going on, and it's one of the few reported times that NORAD has actually ever reported to have taken offensive action against anything. So this was this is so strange that this is happening as I'm writing the book. At the same time, it almost coincidentally, within a couple of days, there were news reports that a group had put themselves together to go find the remains of the Avro Arrow that they'd shot out over the point. They managed to dig them up out of the bottom of the lake and pull them up. So it was okay, well, this is just meant to be, right? So Nixon comes in 1957. He does a bunch of things. Interestingly enough, he comes over, he says the happiest time he ever was and the most grateful he was to see a piece of land is when he saw the green of Prince Edward County, because one of the interesting things about Nixon was, notwithstanding the fact that he was a naval veteran from World War II who was under fire, he suffered from seasickness his entire life. He got horribly seasick on his trip over from Rochester in 1957. And I think this is a big part of the reason why he ends up in Picton Bay, because if I had to guess, they didn't intend to go there, but Nixon had had enough of sailing, which is also part of the reason why he flies back out of the Royal Trenton Air Station, because he decided there's no way he was going to take the boat back because he didn't want to get seasick again. Anyway, so he ends up at the Prince Edward Yacht Club, and he meets some of the local people. There's local celebrities that are there. And one of the people that he meets is the mayor of Picton, who is a local legend in Prince Edward County. You may have heard of him as H.J. McFarland or Harvey McFarland. He had a reputation as a gregarious schmoozer. He's Picton's longest serving mayor. All kinds of stories about Harvey McFarland locally. It was said during World War II that he paved runways and built roads. Like, this is what he did. And so he paved a lot of the runways that they used, the Air Force used. And he was up in Ottawa trying to get payment for a check for a runway he was building up at Mountain View Air Force Base in Prince Edward County. And he couldn't get it, and he literally bowled over the Prime Minister, King. And Harvey recognized him instantly and apologized. And King said, well, what's the hurry? What's going on? So Harvey told him what was going on. He said, I'll take care of it right away. And within 10 minutes, King had called the person in charge and got a check cut for Harvey. That's just like the smallest of stories that Harvey had. He has all stories about this, about famous people all through this time period. He was royalty. He was at the Queen's coronation in 1952. We have the chair at Macaulay House. You can go sit in it if you want. His biographer, Alan Capon, wrote a book called Everybody Called Him Harvey, because he was very down to earth. And there he is at the Queen's coronation. He's got the hat underneath the chair, and that's the chair he sat on that we now have at Macaulay House. I actually took the picture that's on the cover of the book, and it wasn't in color. So I decided I'd try to, jazz it up a bit and practice my painting skills. So I did this book. I include the pictures in there too. So Nixon makes friends with Harvey McFarland, and Harvey McFarland was pretty smart about this because he was such a gregarious schmoozer. He wasn't going to miss a chance to lose the connection. And so from 1957 onward, he made sure every single year he sent the president, the vice president, the later president, even when he wasn't in office, he sent Richard Nixon a Christmas card. He sent him a bottle of scotch, and he sent him cheese. And to the point where his biographer, Alan Capon, says that if you go into the presidential records and you look at the list of people who've given gifts, the second most prolific gift giver to the president of the United States, Harvey J. McFarland, in the world. And, it's something that Nixon never forgot. He talked about it in his 1972 state visit, right? But when McFarland dies in 1974, unexpectedly from a heart attack, Nixon is in the middle of Watergate. He takes the time out of his schedule. He writes this very personal note that I've reproduced in the book, and he gives it to Harvey McFarland's widow and sends along his condolences at Harvey's passing. So there's a little bit more to this story, but this is, one of the really interesting connections that I found in the story. The 1972 visit is kind of where he tells the story of his Picton visit is kind of interesting too. Of course, he meets Pierre Trudeau in that trip. One of the things that's not well remembered is that Nixon was actually stalked by an assassin in 1972. A man by the name of Arthur Bremer had taken a ferry over from Michigan, and he thought that the ferry route across Lake Michigan would be less likely to be scrutinized because he was hiding a gun. And interestingly enough, nobody in the RCMP or nobody in the details around the president had weapons, and there had been a controversy around that. They had wanted to carry weapons, and it had raised questions in the House of Commons at the time. And so nobody, in theory, at one point, the only person who had any weapon guarding the president of the United States was the sergeant at arms who had a sword. Of course, then we've got Arthur Brenner, trying to get close enough to shoot the president of the United States. He was in the crowd at Ottawa's Uplands Airport that year, the runway of which Harvey had paved 10 years before, by the way. Nixon was not especially popular in Canada, so the 1972 visit was a way for him to kind of reach out because he had made some mistakes in the year before. And tell me if this doesn't sound familiar. He decided in 1968 that Canada probably wasn't going to be in the same relationship that they were in before. He unilaterally threatened to end the Otto Pact. He withdrew the United States from a whole bunch of international agreements, including the Bretton Woods financial agreement that had set post-war finances around the world and decoupled the American government from the gold standard. The other thing he did in 1971 was he imposed tariffs on Canada and threatened to do more. And so now that didn't last because fortunately he had good advisors, and Kissinger went to him after a few months and said, you're hurting us more than you are them. They are your best customers, and they are our strongest allies, and we should be doing everything we can to try to help them. So Nixon quietly removes the tariffs, and we'll see what happens now, but that's what happened then. This 36-hour trip in 1970 trip included an address to the joint sitting of Parliament. There he is with Margaret Trudeau and Pat Nixon, who's Richard's wife, of course. And then, do you know who the baby is? It's a baby Justin, 6 months old, 5 months old. He'd been born in December that year. Yeah. So interestingly, at the end of the talk where he talks about visiting Picton and it being the best time he's ever spent in Canada, he takes the time to thank his hosts. And he says, and to the Prime Minister of Canada, Pierre Trudeau, I'd like to congratulate you on the birth of your new son, the next Prime Minister of Canada. So he accurately predicted the ascension of Justin Trudeau. So, I mean, why would, other than the fact that Nixon really did have the best time of his life in Picton, Ontario, Canada, which seems a little hard to believe, and I'm from there, so, why would he have done this? Well, it just so turns out that he's not the only one who visited Picton in that year. Pierre Trudeau helicoptered into the Picton Fair on his Voyager helicopter, landed at the fairgrounds in 1971 in September. And there's a picture of him making a speech. And there's people who remember sitting in the stands with him. He was quite ornery. You can see he's like it's a country fair, remember. He's wearing a white linen suit with a yellow rose in his lapel, right? So everything that everybody had come to expect of Pierre Trudeau. And was quite, irascible in the stands. People were asking for his autograph. He says, "No, I'm trying to watch the fair," and all these people were telling me stories about him just kind of shrugging people off and not wanting to actually talk to anyone. So he had been there, and I suspect what happened is that the advance people for the president would have looked up information about the trip to Canada to find something that the president could talk to people about in a moment. And I think they came across this item, and they talked about Pierre Trudeau having come to Canada or having been in Picton. And Richard Nixon found out about it. And he said, "Oh, I can talk about that," because fancy dancy Pierre Trudeau with his white linen suit and his yellow rose doesn't have the kind of people smarts that I do. And Nixon really thought of himself as a working class president, right? And so he says, well, I can outdo it. It just so happens that maybe this guy knows who the people in Picton are, but I know them a little better than he does. And I've known them for a lot longer than he has as well. And so I think that this little speech that he gives in Rideau Hall is his way of upping Pierre Trudeau at Rideau Hall in front of everybody, and everybody applauds and everything else. So that's, I think, one of the reasons why Nixon told the story. Of course, while I'm writing the book, another bit of synchronicity, I'm writing a book about a world leader coming to the county, going for a drink in a bar and spending the weekend meeting the mayor, right? Who shows up? Justin Trudeau and Sophie Gregoire Trudeau. 2018, he shows up and he visits Hinterland Winery, which is a great winery. They do sparkling wine. It's just it's great wine. Spends the weekend and runs into Mayor Robert Quaife. So I thought, okay, well, this book is meant to be. So I'm, trying to find background on this. And one of the things I'm doing is I'm Googling and trying to find sources. And I go in, I want to find the smoking gun tape, which was the tape that proved that probably that Richard Nixon at least knew about the crime, which occurred at the Watergate complex, which is the picture on the left there. It's a series of 6 buildings. It's a mixed residential commercial. There's a hotel there. There were some offices. Most importantly, the offices of the Democratic National Committee were there. And the Watergate burglars, who called themselves plumbers because one of them said, "What are you doing for the president of the United States?" and said, "We're fixing the leaks." And so they were the plumbers, right? We're going in and putting bugs in the phones. They did this like multiple times. When they get caught, this is at least the second time they've broken into the part of the reason they had to go back is they inserted bugs, but they didn't put good enough batteries in the bugs. So they had to go back and replace the batteries because the bugs had stopped working. But they had done other stuff too. They had broken into the offices of the psychiatrist Daniels Ellsberg, who's the whistleblower for the Pentagon Papers. So again, Nixon had a lot of things that were going on behind the scenes here, a lot to cover up. I was looking for the smoking gun where he's talking with his chief of staff, and he basically admits he knew about it and he was actively seeking to cover up the crime, which is ultimately what sunk him in 1974. And I just decided on him to Google put in the numbers into the search engine, Harvey McFarland. And sure enough, I find a tape of Harvey McFarland in the Oval Office. And all of this is probably because of Nixon's aide, Rosemary Woods. And she becomes famous in the Watergate scandal because 17 minutes of the Watergate tapes get deleted. And she says, well, you know, while I was pushing the pedal to record, the phone rang, and I must have moved my foot and accidentally hit delete while I was talking on the phone. And they said, oh, well, sit at your desk and show us how you did that. And so this is the picture of her doing what they called the Rosemary stretch, because nobody believes she pulled that pose for 17 minutes, right? And it became, you know, ultimately, you know, showed that the White House's account of what had happened lacked credibility. But in the White House tapes that I listened to, which precede or immediately before the actual Watergate situation, Rosemary Woods has decided apparently to take a liking to Harvey McFarland. I've reproduced the transcript in the book so you can see for yourself. And Harvey McFarland has shown up at the White House in 1972 and wants to meet with the president. And so she kind of goes in and schmoozes the president and said, well, you know, I could call him, get him to come in and we could take a picture. And Nixon is like, I don't know, right? Finally, he's okay, bring him in. And so Harvey comes in and they have a little conversation. And so he's on the Watergate tapes. Harvey McFarland's on the Watergate tapes. And, you know, he does a bunch of things. One of the things is he tells another story about being in Picton. At one point, he's on the steps of the Picton Yacht Club with the President of the United States, the mayor of Picton, in 1957. And a little boy comes over to him and says, sir, I really wish my mother was here to see this because she's one of your biggest fans. And he says, well, where is she? And he says, well, unfortunately, she's got the flu because in 1957, we had one of the most virulent flu epidemics that had ever hit in North America. 100,000 people died. But fortunately, it was the first time in human history that there was a purpose-made vaccine that mediated the virus. So again, this all occurred to me when I was writing this during COVID, right? So I was like, holy smokes. This is like, again, more synchronicity. So she probably was sick from the flu, I think. And he says, oh, okay, well, do you think she'd be up for a visit? And the little boy looks at the Vice President of the United States. Well, gee, sir, he says, she's always said if she could, she'd vote for you. And so what Harvey describes is what happened, which is in a couple of later newspaper accounts as well. So I've got it corroborated. The little boy's name was Bill Smith. He was a Boy Scout. He was about 8 years old. He's walking up the town hill. It's a hill, you know, it's 100 feet up to where the houses are, hand in hand with the Vice President of the United States. He has no Secret Service. He has nobody else accompanying him. And they go on and they apparently go knock on the back door. Hi, Mrs. Smith. Your son said you'd like to see me. And they have a little conversation. Can you imagine the Vice President of the United States suddenly shows up at your back door one day? Anyways, this all happened. So I talk about this in the book as well. Nixon had this thing about children that comes out in the book too. He seemed to have a soft spot for some things, animals and children. In another instance at Picton Harbor, with two people who I did interview, who are still alive, they're in their 80s. They were a little older. They actually, Nixon says, is there anything to see around here? And they said, well, we'd be happy to show you. And he goes, led by these two little boys, all around Picton Main Street. And he goes on a little walk around downtown Picton. So this is kind of interesting. This question about Harvey showing up in the White House really begged the question to me, can you just show up in the White House and drop in and get an audience with the president? Well, this is what Elvis does about this same time period. He just literally just showed up, so much so that when he jumps out of the car on Pennsylvania Avenue, the Secret Service at the front gate didn't know who he was, except he was all dressed in like the way he's dressed, right? And so Bud Eagle Crow, who was counsel to the president, who was in his 20s at the time, who I've also spoken with, is not with us anymore, but saw this as a perfect opportunity to connect with young people, because Nixon's ratings, his polls were in the tubes, right, down the tube. So he invites Nixon, and then Elvis comes in. He says, can I get my friends to come in? And he gets a couple members of the band come in, so there's some pictures of him. But Bud Eagle Crow is the only person who was present in this meeting with Nixon in the White House, and literally Elvis just showed up. So if you knew the right people, Rosemary Woods or maybe Bud Eagle Crow, yes, you can get into the White House. I told you the story about the boys, the two boys and the Boy Scout. I kept coming across these stories in both in Picton, but in Nixon's background too. And I was really quite shocked because, like many of you who experienced Nixon directly or indirectly through other people, you would have grown up with tales of Nixon as an unindicted criminal, a bad man who was a corrupt politician, not very honest. And he was all those things. But he was also other things too. And I was shocked by some of the nice things that I found out about him, right? Once as a child, when his parents owned a grocery store in Whittier in California, and they caught a shoplifter, an older woman, and the mother was about to phone the police. And 8-year-old Richard Nixon convinces his mother to extend the woman a line of credit rather than call the police. And that kind of thing happened regularly, right? Nixon's friendship with Harvey McFarland and the two little boys that lead him around town in Picton, Herb Stone and Ken Richmond, who I've interviewed. I reproduced the details of those trips. I haven't included all the details in this talk. The story on tapes of visiting the boy's mother in Picton, and many other stories, including more in Picton. He basically runs into a homeless man at the top of the town hill in Picton and gives him money, stops and talks to him, and he's ranting and raving. In the 1950s, he's homeless, he's probably drunk, or at least something's wrong, right? He's altered in some way. Nixon takes the time to chat with him and actually gives him money. How often does the vice president, go walking along in a small rural Ontario town and, hand over dollars to, homeless people? Anyways, very interesting. A couple other little synchronicities here. The people on the trip with him included Karl Hallauer, who is the head of Bausch and Lomb. So well-heeled supporters, right? He probably owed favors to some of these people. C.R. Smith, who was president of American Airlines. Paul Miller, who goes on to become the head of the Associated Press and chairman of Gannett Corporation, which Gannett Corporation is a newspaper corporation that still exists. They own USA Today, and they were rivals for the Hearst chain of newspapers. So he was also an important supporter. But probably the most interesting was Senator Harry Flood. Senator Harry Flood was from Virginia and was very interested in civil rights. Of course, what most people don't remember about Nixon is that he was a huge civil rights advocate. In 1960, when he runs against Kennedy, he earns the support of Martin Luther King and Jackie Robinson. They don't support Kennedy, they support Nixon because they thought Nixon was going to be better for civil rights. And so really interesting. I can only imagine the chuckle that Harry Flood had when Nixon people called him up and said, "Hey, how'd you like to go sailing with the president up in Canada? We'll go across Lake Ontario and we'll visit Prince Edward County," because there's a few Prince Edward counties in the world, but one of them is in the middle of Virginia, and that's it right there. It's also the place, most people have probably heard of the U.S. Supreme Court decision in Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education, which is the 1953 civil rights decision that said segregation of schools is wrong and has to be ended. It was actually 5 cases before the Supreme Court. They were all bundled together. They put Topeka and Brown and the Topeka Board of Education in there first because that was the one of the 5 that wasn't from a former slave state. So they wanted to make sure that that didn't happen. But one of those cases was Darling and Prince Edward County. Darling versus Prince Edward County, and it was Prince Edward County, Virginia. And it was a case that was started by this young girl who's the only student who started one of these civil rights cases. Her name is Barbara Johns. She's a hero. And she complained about the segregation in her hometown of Farmville in Prince Edward County. So Harry Flood was a segregationist, and he was trying to stop a civil rights bill that was coming before Congress in 1957, the first of the civil rights bills, and Nixon looked likely to support it. So he was probably on the trip to lobby Nixon and tell him, don't do that. Didn't succeed, of course. And in fact, as I say, not only didn't Harry Flood succeed in not having that 1957 civil rights bill passed, Nixon is sometimes remembered as being a bit racist, and he is not a bit racist. He is racist on the tapes, right? He uses a lot of derogatory language. But if you look at his substantial accomplishments, actually quite amazing, to me at least. We're very worried right now about the fact that the rule of law may be under threat. And I'm a former lawyer. I taught at Queen's. I advised the courts for many years about rights and constitutional law. It's interesting that we're very worried that the president of the United States might not follow a court decision, because the Brown versus Topeka Board of Education occurs in 1953. By 1968, 15 full years after the US Supreme Court decision, they still hadn't enforced it. Neither Republican nor Democratic presidents had successfully enforced the desegregation order from the US Supreme Court. And it wasn't until Nixon becomes president that he demands that they do so. When he takes office, only 8% of schools were desegregated. By the time he leaves in 1974, it's over 90% of schools in the United States. He is the person who was responsible for desegregation of American schools more than anyone. So I think that's really interesting, because most people remember Nixon in a very different way. There's me with the former Chief Justice of the Superior Court of Justice, telling her about Nixon a few years ago. One of the questions I had was, did Nixon go drinking? There was a bunch of unanswered questions that I haven't answered, and I maybe won't answer. I have to keep some of my secrets, otherwise you won't buy the book, right? Did Nixon really go drinking in a Prince Edward County bar? Well, I'm going to tell you, he did go drinking somewhere, and there is a story that comes out of that, but it's not exactly what he said, of course, because Nixon liked to tell tales, right? Did he really go golfing in Canada? Yes, he did. I've got the golf card. I see what he shot, and I can tell you where. Yeah, you got to read the book to find out. What might Nixon later have made up? Why might he later made up Nick's stories about the county story? Well, part of it was politically convenient for him to do so, right? Trudeau had just been there, so it was nice that he could also talk about the same place and show his touch with the common person, as much as the Prime Minister of Canada did. But Nixon was also famous for confabulism, and so this is like people who inadvertently transpose facts and they don't even realize they've done it. So he was a liar. There's no doubt about that. But he also just transposed facts all the time. And he would say things that were just completely non sequiturs sometimes. And he wouldn't even realize he'd made a mistake. He just, moved facts around in his own head. When you read the transcript of his trip to Canada, he keeps saying he's on Lake Erie, which, you would think you would, and he says it more than once. He says, a couple times at least. He was on Lake Erie. No, you weren't on Lake Erie. You were on Lake Ontario. How could you not know where you were? But this is just proof to me that, this happened all the time. And when I talked to Bud Eagle Crow about this, he said, oh, yeah. He said he would do this all the time. I would come and tell him a fact about, some policy he wanted to promote. And then he'd go on and he'd phone up a newspaper and he'd talk to a reporter and he'd change it all around. It would say something completely different, unlike current president, who always gets the facts right? Anyway, so as I say, what's old is new again. You read this book and it's like, oh my goodness, some of these things have happened before. I wonder what's going to happen this time, right? And so this also leads me to, my area of interest as a lawyer and someone who's taught law, which is what are the past and current challenges to things like rule of law. I do a couple of things. Nixon played golf, but his real sport, he wasn't a big golfer. He really only took up golf when he became vice president because Eisenhower loved golf. Donald Trump has still not outplayed the number of times Eisenhower played golf. Okay, Eisenhower was the golfingest president of the United States, and so Nixon knew if he was going to ever get Eisenhower's ear, he was going to have to learn to play, and this is what he did. But he never got very good at it. He really liked bowling, and Harry Truman had a bowling lane installed in the White House, and he would go down between meetings and he would bowl a few games. And so this is a picture of him bowling. People think that's a joke. No, he actually loved bowling. He was like a very working class guy who loved bowling. I do a little tour in Picton. I'm going to do an anniversary tour July 4th this year. The anniversary visit is the 5th, but July 4th seems appropriate because there'll be American visitors in Picton. But if you'd like, I do it through the library. So if you'd like to come on a little walk, it's about 1 kilometer. It's not far. We do Picton history. I tell some more stories about Richard Nixon, some other stories as well. My book is available in local libraries, Belleville, Toronto, Prince Edward County. It's not Kingston so far as I know. Okay. Yeah, Canada. In Canada, the thing about that is some authors in some other places might say, well, no, I don't want to go to a library because then I don't get a sale. In Canada, the Canada Council for the Arts actually pays authors if their books are in libraries. So I got a nice little check a few weeks ago for my books in the limited number of libraries I've got. Some people get bigger checks than I get, believe me. But, so this is kind of a nice thing. So a library is always a good place to get it. It's in Amazon Indigo online, so you can get it there. I have copies here today, which you're welcome to buy as well. I'll be happy to sign it for you. If you don't see it, ask for it. Your local bookstore can order it. And, I'm happy to be here today, but I'm also could talk for another 5 hours about this topic. So if you have another opportunity for me to speak and you've enjoyed the talk today, I'd be happy to come and speak with you further. So that's pretty much it, unless anybody has any questions.
You remind us that there have been happier times. Many American politicians have frequented Canada, often for vacation reasons. Dean Rusk, as a student, worked in the Canadian mining camps. Roosevelt kept a cottage, a magnificent cottage on Campbell Island. Roosevelt took secret fishing trips to Canada. President Taft liked going to Murray Bay, et cetera, et cetera. So you've extended that history. I was glad to hear that nowhere in your talk or in the tapes there was any mention of 51st State. That's comforting. Now, if we have any questions, I'm sure Thomas would like to take them. If you have one, please raise your hand, and I'm going to bring the microphone to you. So wait till I get there, and then you can ask your question. So, questions?
Where did Nixon stay when he was in Picton?
Oh, sorry. So the question is, where did Nixon stay when he was in Picton? So, this is a really good question. And the short answer is I'm not entirely sure. But given that he was a vice president of the United States, I think he had probably some arrangement. And the boat he comes on over is a boat called the Widgeon. It's a 70-foot schooner, 3-masted and crewed. I've talked to one of the people who worked on the boat when Nixon was there. So I suspect Nixon stayed on the boat. And so I think what happened was he came over on the Friday night. He is seasick. They anchor somewhere in order to get Nixon get his sea legs back. And then he says, I really don't want to even sail over to the golf course where he's going to go, which I'm not going to tell you what it is because I want you to read the book. But he says, let's go. And Paul Miller knew about Picton Bay, so came into Picton. And they had some time to kill because they were making arrangements about what they would do. I think they were probably hiring a car. And then they went to the golf course and they played golf and they sailed the boat around. The boat was a common sight in the Bay of Quinte in the 1950s. The owner, Frank Gannett, had been a presidential candidate himself in the 1940s and was a huge figure in American journalism and American politics. So I think that is where he stayed. And I think that, after a few nights, he decided, well, time to fly back. And then, of course, he flies back and lands in Rochester. The first thing he does is go golfing. And so, interestingly enough, there's a little item in the Picton Gazette about this, and maybe a couple of other papers. More or less, everybody ignores him. When he arrives back in Rochester on the Monday morning, there's like 7 outlets that report on the visit. And that's a lot of the details from the trip are actually from him and his colleagues who he's on the trip with him, telling the reporters what they did in Canada during the last 3 days. Because everybody down there is, oh my God, the vice president of the United States, everybody in Canada was like, yeah, okay, whatever, here's some cheese. Here's a bottle of Crown Royal, go have some fun, right? But I also think the other thing that is possible is Nixon said he was seasick, which I think is probably true. Nixon was also, in the 1950s in particular, a big drinker. So he wouldn't have wanted to do that in public. So back at the boat would have been a more private location where he could drink Harvey McFarlane's bottle of Canadian rye whiskey, which he mentions in the White House tapes later too. So he really enjoyed the rye whiskey.
Well, I think you've satisfied us very fully. Thank you very much. On behalf of the Society, I'd like to thank Thomas and present him with a little memento of his evening with us, including the little badge that we give to all our speakers.
Well,
So
that's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed the chance to come here and share it with you. So, and I'll stick around for a little bit if anybody is shy about asking questions in front of everybody. I'd be happy to chat and talk about the book a little more if you want. So,
thank you.
Yeah.
I'll remind you that our next lecture is on May the 21st, when we will be visited by Dr. Ken Fingelman, who is an archaeologist under the oceans, and he'll be talking about something that was mentioned tonight, the Marysville Vortex, where he has dived and explored And he will also be showing us a video of the world history seen below the water. So that's May the 21st, 20th, thank you. Wednesday, here again. So until then, thank you, and here's Peter again.
My last announcement, which I forgot before, many of you will know about the Jane's Walks, which are half hour, 1 hour, going a little bit longer, first weekend in May. They are all in Kingston. They are led by people who know the area. And if you go onto the Jane's Walks website, you'll see there are about 10 or 15 of them on the Friday, the Saturday, and the Sunday. And if you're go onto the our website, you'll find a link to it as well. Well worth it. If you get tired halfway through the walk, you just leave. They're fun. The times I've done them on William Street, we've totally blocked William Street, and with 40 or 50 people sometimes, and the cars have had to just wait for me to stop talking. So go and enjoy yourself on that first weekend of May. The weather's always wonderful that weekend as well. Thanks indeed. And we'll see you back here in a month, if not on the Jane Walk.